Hi guys, Miss Hanna here, and it's time for some bedtime stories. Today we're actually going to be reading some tall tales. The tall tales we're going to read today are about Paul Bunyan and John Henry. So I'll get started first with Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan, this book, it has been retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg. Got very pretty pictures, so I'm going to do my best to show you the pictures. Here we go. Here's our first opening picture. Paul Bunyan, a tall tale retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg. Let's move over a little bit so you can see. So Paul Bunyan was the largest, smartest, and strongest baby ever born in the state of Maine. Even before he learned to talk, Paul showed an interest in the family logging business. He took the lumber wagon and wandered through the neighborhood collecting trees. There were so many complaints about Paul's visits that his parents anchored his cradle in the harbor. All was well until Paul started rocking the cradle and stirring up waves, and after his parents had paid for the damage, they decided to move to the backwoods where life would be more peaceful. Paul loved his new wilderness home. He soon grew into a sturdy lad who was so quick on his feet he could blow out a candle and leap into bed before the room became dark. Every day he joined his forest friends in their sports. He raced with the deer and wrestled with the grizzlies. One morning, Paul awoke to find the world under a blanket of blue snow. He heard a moan from inside a snowdrift, and there he found a shivering ox calf. Paul adopted him and named him Babe. Both Paul and Babe began growing at an astonishing rate, but the ox never lost the color of the snow from which he'd been rescued. As the years passed, the two of them proved to be extremely helpful in the family business. At 17, Paul grew a fine beard, which he combed with the top of a pine tree. By this time, other settlers were beginning to crowd into the Maine woods. Paul felt an urge to move on. He said goodbye to his parents and headed west. Paul wanted to cross the country with the best lumbering crew available. He hired Ole, a celebrated blacksmith, and two famous cooks, Sourdough Slim and Cream Puff Fatty. Then he signed up legendary lumbermen like Big Tim Burr, Hardjaw Murphy, and the 7 Hackett brothers. Paul put the camp buildings on wheels so that Babe could haul them from one forest to another. As soon as he had cleared the land, pioneers moved in to set up farms and villages. On the far slopes of the Appalachian Mountains, several of Paul's men were ambushed by a gang of underground ogres called gumbaroos. Paul grabbed the camp dinner horn and blew a thunderous note into the gumbaroos' cave, determined to blast the meanness right out of them. To Paul's dismay, the gumbaroos responded by snatching the entire crew. A wild, rough and tumble rumpus began inside the den. When that historic tussle was over, the gumbaroos needed 6 weeks to untangle themselves. They disappeared into the depths of the earth, and they've never been heard from since. Paul's next job was to clear the heavily forested Midwest. He hired armies of extra woodsmen and built enormous new bunkhouses. The men sailed up to bed in balloons and parachuted down to breakfast in the morning. Unfortunately, the cooks couldn't flip flapjacks fast enough to satisfy all the newcomers. To solve the muddle, Paul built a colossal flapjack griddle. The surface was greased by kitchen helpers with slabs of bacon laced to their feet. Every time the hot griddle was flooded with batter, it blasted a delicious flapjack high above the clouds, and usually the flapjacks landed neatly beside the griddle, but sometimes they were a bit off target. Paul took a few days off to dig the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes so that barges of Vermont maple syrup could be brought to camp. That seems like a good reason to me. Fueled by the powerful mixture of flapjacks and syrup, the men leveled the Great Plains and shaved the slopes of the Rocky Mountains. They probably would have sawed the peaks themselves into logs if a blizzard hadn't suddenly buried the entire mountain range. That blizzard continued for several years, snuffing out the springs, summers, and autumns. The crew burrowed into their bunkhouses and hibernated. Babe became so depressed that Paul asked Ole to make a pair of sunglasses for his friend. When Babe saw the world colored green, he thought he'd stumbled into a field of clover. He began eating the snow with such gusto that soon the treetops reappeared. At that point, all those pent-up spring times exploded, dissolving the storm clouds in the remaining snow. Paul and his friends invited some newly arrived settlers to join them in a celebration of all the holidays that had been missed. After the festival, the lumberjacks continued their journey, but as they headed southwest, the blistering sun and the giant Texas varmints proved to be more of a problem than they had expected. Travel became so difficult that some of the men began to speak longingly of being buried by a blizzard or a bear hugged by a gumbaroo. While crossing Arizona, the griddle curled up like a burned leaf and the batter evaporated. Deprived of their flapjacks, the lumbermen became weak and discouraged. Paul's great axe fell from his shoulder, gouging a jagged trench which today is known as the Grand Canyon. Disaster seemed certain until Paul came up with a desperate plan. He headed east and found a family that could sell him a barn filled with corn. Babe galloped back across the desert. When the flaming sunrise hit that barn, it exploded, and the lumbermen awoke to find themselves in a raging blizzard of popcorn. Dizzy with joy, they pulled on their mittens and began blasting each other with popcorn balls. A westerly wind kept the cooling clouds of popcorn swirling around Paul and his crew until they crossed California and reached the Pacific Ocean. Now, after he had crossed the country, some say that Paul gave up lumbering and rambled north searching for new areas of untouched wilderness. With the passing years, Paul has been seen less and less frequently. However, along with his unusual size and strength, he seems to possess an extraordinary longevity. Sometimes his great bursts of laughter can be heard rumbling like distant thunder across the wild Alaskan mountain ranges, where he and Babe still roam. The end. So, I liked that book. How about you? It's always one of my favorite tall tales. Now, this tall tale is John Henry, and it's by Julius Lester with pictures by Jerry Pinkney. This one is a beautiful book, and this one is my son's favorite. So let's read this one for you. John Henry. Okay, here we go. Now, you have probably never heard of John Henry. Or maybe you heard about him but don't know the ins and outs of his comings and goings. Well, that's why I'm going to tell you about him. When John Henry was born, birds came from everywhere to see him. The bears and panthers and moose and deer and rabbits and squirrels and even a unicorn came out of the woods to see him. And instead of the sun tending to his business and going to bed, it was peeping out from behind the moon's skirts trying to get a glimpse of the new baby. There's this one. There's little John Henry. Now, before long, the mama and papa come out on the porch to show off their brand new baby. The birds oohed and the animals awed at how handsome the baby was. Somewhere in the middle of one of the oohs, or maybe it was on the backside of one of the ahs, the baby jumped out of his mama's arms and started growing. He grew and he grew and he grew. He grew until his head and shoulders busted through the roof, which was over the porch. John Henry thought that this was the funniest thing in the world. He laughed so loud the sun got scared. It scurried from behind the moon's skirts and went to bed, which is where it should have been all the while. Now, the next morning, John Henry was up at sunrise. The sun wasn't. He was tired and had decided to sleep in. John Henry wasn't going to have none of that. He hollered up to the sky, "Get up from there, I've got things to do, and I need light to do 'em by." The sun yawned, washed its face, flossed and brushed its teeth, and hurried up over the horizon. That day, John Henry helped his papa rebuild the porch he had busted through, added a wing onto the house with an indoor swimming pool, and one of them jacuzzis. After lunch, he chopped down an acre of trees and split them into fireplace logs, and still had time for a nap before supper. The next day, John Henry went to town. He met up with the meanest man in the state, ferret-faced Freddy, sitting on his big white horse. You know what he was doing? He was thinking of mean things to do. Ferret-faced Freddy was so mean, he cried if he had a nice thought. John Henry said, "Freddy, I'll make you a bet. Let's have a race. You on your horse, me on my legs. If you and your horse win, you can work me as hard as you want for a whole year. If I win, you have to be nice for a year." Ferret-faced Freddy laughed an evil laugh. "It's a deal, John Henry." His voice sounded like bat wings on tombstones. The next morning, folks lined up all along the way the race would go. John Henry was ready. Ferret-faced Freddy and his horse were ready. Bang! The race was on. My great-granddaddy's brothers, cousins, sister-in-law's uncle's aunt was there that morning. She said everybody saw Ferret-faced Freddy ride by on his big white horse, and they were sure enough moving. Didn't nobody see John Henry. That's because he was so fast, the wind was out of breath trying to keep up with him. When Ferret-faced Freddy crossed the finish line, John Henry was already on the other side, sitting in a rocking chair and drinking a soda pop. After that, Ferret-faced Freddy was so nice, everybody called him Frederick the Friendly. John Henry decided it was time for him to go on down the big road. He went home and told his mama and daddy goodbye. His daddy said, "You gotta have something to make your way in the world with, son. These belong to your granddaddy." And he gave him 2 20-pound sledgehammers with 4 foot handles made of whalebone. A day or so later, John Henry saw a crew building a road. At least that's what they were doing until they came on a boulder right smack dab where the road was supposed to go. This was no ordinary boulder. It was as hard as anger and so big around it took half a week for a tall man to walk from one side to the other. John Henry offered to lend them a hand. "That's all right. We'll put some dynamite to it." John Henry smiled to himself. "Whatever you say." The road crew planted dynamite all around the rock and set it off. Kabloom, blamity, blamity, ba-boom, ba-bang, ba-boom. That dynamite made so much racket the Almighty looked over the parapets of heaven and hollered, "It's getting too noisy down there." The dynamite kicked up so much dirt and dust it got dark.
The moon thought night had caught her napping, and she hurried out so fast she almost bumped into the sun, who was still climbing the steep hill towards noontime. When all the commotion from the dynamite was over, the road crew was amazed. The boulder was still there. In fact, the dynamite hadn't even knocked a chip off of it. The crew didn't know what to do. Then they heard a rumbling noise. They looked around. It was John Henry laughing. He said, "If you gentlemen would give me a little room, I've got some work to do." "I don't see how you can do what dynamite couldn't," said the boss of the crew. John Henry chuckled. "Just watch me." He swung one of his hammers round and round his head. It made such a wind that leaves blew off the trees and birds fell out the sky. Ring! The hammer hit the boulder. That boulder shivered like you do on a cold winter morning when it looks like the school bus is never going to come. The hammer hit the boulder. Ring! That boulder shivered like the morning when freedom came to the slaves. John Henry picked up his other hammer. He swung one hammer in a circle over his head, and as soon as it hit the rock, ring! The hammer in his left hand started to make a circle, and ring! Soon, the ring of one hammer followed the ring of the other one so closely it sounded like they were falling at the same time. Ring, 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 ring. Chips and dust were flying from the boulder so fast that John Henry vanished from sight, but you could still hear his hammers. Ring, ring! The air seemed to be dancing to the rhythm of his hammers. The boss of the road crew looked up. His mouth dropped open. He pointed to the sky. There in the air above the boulder was a rainbow. John Henry was swinging the hammers so fast he was making a rainbow around his shoulders. It was shining and shimmering in the dust and grit like hope that never dies. John Henry started singing, "I got a rainbow ring tied round my shoulder. Ring, ring, it ain't gonna rain. No, it ain't gonna rain. Ring, ring." John Henry sang, and he hammered, and the air danced, and the rainbow shimmered, and the earth shook and rolled from the blows of the hammer. Finally, it was quiet. Slowly, the dust cleared. Folks could not believe their eyes. The boulder was gone. In its place was the prettiest and straightest road they had ever seen. Not only had John Henry pulverized the boulder into pebbles, he had finished building the road. In the distance where the new road connected to the main one, the road crew saw John Henry waving goodbye, a hammer on each shoulder, and the rainbow draped around him like love. John Henry went on his way. He had heard that any man good with a hammer could find work building the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad through West Virginia. That was where he'd been going when he stopped to build the road. The next day, John Henry arrived at the railroad. However, work had stopped. The railroad tracks had to go through a mountain, and such a mountain. Next to it, even John Henry felt small. But a worker told John Henry about a new machine they were going to use to tunnel through the mountain. It was called a steam drill. It can hammer faster and harder than 10 men, and it never has to stop and rest. The next day, the boss arrived with the steam drill. John Henry said to him, "Let's have a contest. Your steam drill against me and my hammers." The man laughed. "I heard you're the best there ever was, John Henry, but you can't out-hammer a machine." "Let's find out," John Henry answered. Boss shrugged. "Don't make me no never mind. You start on the other side of the mountain. I'll start the steam drill over here. Whoever gets to the middle first is the winner." The next morning, all was still. The birds weren't singing and the roosters weren't crowing. When the son didn't hear the rooster, he wondered if something was wrong, so he rose a couple of minutes early to see. What he saw was a mountain as big as hurt feelings. On one side was a big machine hooked up to hoses. It was belching smoke and steam. As the machine attacked the mountain, the dirt, rocks, and underbrush flew into the air. On the other side was John Henry. Next to the mountain, he didn't look much bigger than a wish that wasn't going to come true. He had a 20-pound hammer in each hand and muscles hard as wisdom in each arm. As he swung them through the air, they shone like silver, and when the hammers hit the rock, they rang like gold. Before long, tongues of fire leaped out with each blow. There's John Henry right there. Can you see him? There's John Henry. The steam machine, I'm sure, you can see it's right there on that side of the mountain. So they're both working hard. Now on the other side, the boss of the steam drill felt the mountain shudder. He got scared and hollered, "I believe this mountain is caving in." From the darkness inside the mountain came a deep voice. "It's just my hammer sucking wind. Just my hammer sucking wind." There wasn't a room inside the tunnel for the rainbow, so it wrapped itself around the mountain on the side where John Henry was. Now, all through the night, John Henry and the steam drill went at it. In the light from the tongues of fire shooting out of the tunnel from John Henry's hammer blows, folks could see the rainbow wrapped around the mountain like a shawl. The sun came up extra early the next morning to see who was winning. Just as it did, John Henry broke through and met the steam drill. The boss of the steam drill was flabbergasted. John Henry had come 1.25 miles. The steam drill had only come 1/4. Folks were cheering and yelling, "John Henry! John Henry!" John Henry walked out of the tunnel into the sunlight, raised his arms over his head, a hammer in each hand. The rainbow slid off the mountain and around his shoulders. With a smile, John Henry's eyes closed, and slowly he fell to the ground. John Henry was dead. He had hammered so hard and so fast and so long that his big heart had burst. Everybody was silent for a minute. Then came the sound of soft crying. Some said it came from the moon. Another one said she saw the sun shed a tear. Then something strange happened. Afterward, folks swore the rainbow whispered it. I don't know. But whether it was a whisper or a thought, everyone had the same knowing at the same moment. Dying ain't important. Everybody does that. What matters is how well you do your living. First, one person started clapping, then another, and another. Soon, everybody was clapping. The next morning, the sun got everybody up early to say goodbye to John Henry. They put him on a flatbed railroad car, and the train made its way slowly out of the mountains. All along the way, folks lined both sides of the track, and they were cheering and shouting through their tears, "John Henry! John Henry!" John Henry's body was taken to Washington, D.C. Now, some say he was buried on the White House lawn late one night while the President and Mrs. President was asleep. I don't know about none of that. What I do know is this. If you walk by the White House late at night, stand real still and listen real closely. Folks say you just might hear a deep voice singing, "I got a rainbow, ring, ring, tied round my shoulder, ring, ring. It ain't gonna rain, no, it ain't gonna rain, ring, ring." The end of John Henry. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed those tall tales as much as I did. Those were some of my favorites. And I hope that you'll look into some other tall tales, because there are some other really good ones that you can read. Another one is like Johnny Appleseed. That's a good one to read. Why don't you give that one a try? And until then, I will see you soon on Sunday for some more stories at 6 o'clock. I can't wait. Can you? Bye.